Hilchos Parah Adumah Perek Chamisha Asar. The laws of the red cow, chapter 15. The last chapter. A wonderful day to finish a set of laws on Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of the month of Teves. May it be a new month of blessing for all the Jewish people. What is the last chapter about? The last chapter is about the impurity that's transmitted by the Parah Adumah waters. Till now we're talking about the procedure of the Parah Adumah, preparing it and sprinkling it, and how it helps for other impurities. But the waters themselves, in their own context, have a type of impurity, which is another reason why it's in this book, because this book we talk about all the sources of impurity. And today we're going to learn the conditions under which Parah Adumah water spreads its impurity. So the Rambam begins with the following scenario. Halacha Aleph. Hanogeya b'meichatos shalei l'tzei lechaza. If somebody touches Parah Adumah waters, and here in the first case we're talking about even a minute amount, a tiny amount of Parah Adumah water, without a necessity for sprinkling. You're not in the middle of transporting it to go do a sprinkling job. You're just touching it. Bein adam, bein kelim, whether it's a person touching it or utensils touching the water, tamei, they become impure. Ve'enei metame begadim b'shas magoy. But when it's so little amount, the impurity only goes to the person or the utensil, not to anything that they're touching while they're in contact with the water. In contrast to what we had in the beginning of these laws, when somebody's involved in the Parah Adumah process, whatever he's touching during the act also becomes impure. Here it just stays by the person or by the utensil. Shenemar, as it says, anybody who touches the sprinkling waters becomes impure till evening. Now, from the fact that the water can make people and utensils impure, which is reserved only for av hatumos, primary sources of impurity, from this you learn that the sprinkling waters are indeed one of the primary fathers of impurity, biblical impurity. V'tumas magon b'kol shehu. And again, what I said before, here the Rambam says it clearly, the impurity imparted through touching is even at the slightest amount. Now, what if there's more than the slightest amount? If there was enough quantity in this water for you to go and technically do a sprinkling job on somebody who was impure from a corpse, mitamin b'maga uvemasa, then the waters transmit impurity both by direct contact and also by carrying. And therefore, if you touch them or carry them without a need of sprinkling, not only are you impure, but you transmit impurity to all clothes or utensils that you're touching while you're touching the water or carrying the water until you separate from the source of impurity. Some discussion about the b'shas magoy. Some say that it means even when you touch water, you're really also carrying them, because you cannot touch water without moving it. So the main extra level of tumah comes not from the touching, but from the movement that happens to the water, and therefore the tumah also transmits to whatever you're wearing or whatever you're touching. How do we know this? How do we know there's difference between when there's less than the amount and the amount of sprinkling? Shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, Umaze mehanida yechabes begadav. Here it is. The person who sprinkles the sprinkling water needs to wash his clothes. That sounds like the person who does the sprinkling becomes tameh. Now, obviously this pasuk is not talking about the regular kohen who's sprinkling on an impure person. Because if he can purify somebody that's impure, certainly he himself should remain pure. Rather, we learn from tradition. When Torah says the person who sprinkles the sprinkling water, it doesn't mean you're actually sprinkling it, it means you're carrying enough to be sprinkled. This pasuk is stated to give us a minimum size, a minimum quantity. That if somebody carries or touches sprinkling water, enough quantity to do a sprinkling job, but he's not carrying it or touching it for the sprinkling job, he is impure and also transmits impurity to his clothing by biblical law. How much is that quantity, the amount of sprinkling? The amount it takes to have the 3 hyssop branches dipped in the water, however much water that would absorb. Now, all of this that we just said, that if you're touching mei chatos, not for the needs of sprinkling, it makes you impure, says the Rambam, when do we even say this law? That waters of Parah Adumah can transmit impurity. If you touch them or carry them unnecessarily before any mitzvah was done with them. But if a certain quantity of Parah Adumah water was used to actually sprinkle and purify somebody, once they're used, the water no longer transmits impurity. Ketal, what does that mean? A person dips the hyssop in the water, sprinkles it on people that are impure, utensils that are impure, and so much water is dripping down the person and pooling on the ground. Or just any of the water that sprinkled all over the place. When you spritz water, it doesn't only go to the place that you were targeting, it goes everywhere. Or it lands up on pure people. Those waters, once they're already used for a mitzvah, they're pure. If you carry them or touch them, you're pure. But if you dip the hyssop in the water with the intent to sprinkle something which anyways never became impure because it isn't susceptible to impurity, technically speaking, the water which drips from them could be reused as kosher sprinkling water, which means the mitzvah hasn't been done with them. Which means, therefore, they will transmit the impurity of the Parah Adumah waters, because they haven't done their mitzvah yet. Because when you immersed it in the water, which is technically the point at which the mitzvah is done, it wasn't for a mitzvah. There was nothing to be done. There was no vulnerable utensil that had to be sprinkled upon. Halacha Beis, even what we're saying, that before the mitzvah is done, it transmits impurity, there's also a caveat to that. Ein mechatas metamin es hakoil, kaidim sheyasu mitzvason. Parah Adumah waters does not transmit impurity to everything before the mitzvah was done. Ad sheyu tahirun uksherin lahazah. The waters themselves have to be of good quality. They have to be themselves pure, kosher for sprinkling. Aval mechatas shenifsalu, but if the Parah Adumah waters would have become disqualified, at least in a way of rabbinic disqualification, maybe some other water got mixed into them. Parah Adumah water, other water got mixed into them. Or an animal drank from the Parah Adumah waters, or the like, things that would disqualify it. So now, the water themselves have already been degraded. And therefore, if somebody who's pure at the lower status of truma touches them, nitma, he becomes impure. Whether you touch by hand or any other part of the body. But if a person was pure to the higher level of Parah Adumah status, even if he touches direct contact with his hand, he stays pure. Because for him, the waters of the Parah Adumah do not transmit impurity when they themselves have gone down a level. Now, there seems to be an inherent problem here. Because once the water has been degraded, it can no longer be used for sprinkling. So anytime you handle the water, I don't care at what level of purity you are, you're handling water not for the needs of sprinkling. So that itself should make you impure. So the commentaries say, either you didn't know that it was disqualified, so you touched it under the pretense of using it for sprinkling, or you were trying to move it to make space for other kosher sprinkling waters. So you weren't moving it for no need at all, it was for the needs of sprinkling with other good waters. Halacha Gimel, mechatas shenitmu, if Parah Adumah waters became actually impure, and by impure we don't mean one of the chapter 13 stringencies. We mean actual sources of impurity, at least rabbinic ones. After they became impure, somebody who's pure on the level of truma touches them, whether by hand or by body, he becomes impure. But if a person who's pure for the standards of Parah Adumah touches them, then it depends. By hand, direct contact, he becomes impure, because the water is impure. But the rest of his body, if he touches it, he's as pure as he was. Because it doesn't go through the irregular contact. Halacha Daled, mechatas shenaflu b'seichon, mei mayon, mei mikveh, mei peris. Parah Adumah waters that had other waters mixed into it. Freshwater stream, regular stagnant mikveh waters, fruit juices. So, imreiv mechatas, if the majority is made up of Parah Adumah waters, metamin b'masa, they will transmit impurity through carrying it, at least to those people that are pure for the level of truma. Not if you're in the level of chatas, as we had in the last halachas. If the majority is fruit juice, ein metamin, they don't give off any impurity at all. Mechza lemechza metamin, half, we go stringently, and they still transmit impurity. That's for the water getting mixed up. What if you have the ashes? Parah Adumah ashes mixes with regular oven ash. the kidesh bekulan, and you actually mixed all this ash into water. Because if you didn't mix the ash into water, the commentaries say, then you're just dealing with ash of the Parah Adumah after it's become ash. There's no problem. You're totally pure. But once you're mekadesh them, now you have to know what's the law. So, if the majority was Parah Adumah ash, metamin b'meinida, the fact that they have now come into contact with the water of the Parah Adumah gives it the Parah Adumah power, and it transmits impurity. But if the majority is of an ash, no longer do they become impure or transmit impurity with touching, but they do transmit impurity with carrying. And the question then is, what's the difference between ash and water? So the commentary said, because water becomes fully mixed in. It's moist, it's lach belach, moist with moist. But ash is just a dry entity, so we just don't know where the proper ash is, so therefore it still retains some of its identity, at least if there's enough ash to technically been able to be mekadesh water. Therefore you have to retain some of the impurity, at least the masa. Halacha hey, efer kasher shenesani al gabi hamayim she'eina ru'in lekadshan. You have kosher ash, and you put it on top of water that you shouldn't have put it into. The water themselves were not fit to become holy. The nagabahen atar letruma, and now somebody who's pure on the status of truma touches them. Bin biyada bin begufay, by hand or by rest of his body, nitma becomes impure. Nagabahen atar lechatas afilu biyadav, person who's pure at the higher level touches them even by hand. Hayez atar k'meshay, stays pure, because it's like the last case where the water became impure. Same thing. It only affects people on lower level purity, not higher level purity. Vav mechatas shenifsalu. Once water of Parah Adumah becomes disqualified, lo yegablin betit. Do not think that now you can mix them into mud and make some clay. That might make it a stumbling block to other people. Somebody will touch the clay, the mud, and he'll become impure. Because the water of the Parah Adumah does not become nullified in the mud. It says it is a chatas, it retains its status. Now how come with water and water that worked? So either some say because the water doesn't mix so well into the clay, that's one interpretation, or it's not really considered a mixture, because water and clay are two different entities. So it never really mixes, never really fuses. The water retains its identity, and therefore you want to avoid that. Halacha zayin, Parah shasas mechatos. If a cow drinks Parah Adumah water, even though the cow was slaughtered within 24 hours, its flesh is pure. Same verse as before. Has to be guarded for the sprinkling waters. While they're still guarded, they don't lose their identity. But once a cow drinks it, they become nullified, for they're no longer being guarded, either because of Hesach Hadas, diversion of the mind, no one's paying attention to them, whatever it is, there's different discussions over here. But the point is that once the cow drinks it, it loses its identity. Halacha Ches, it seems that in the Beis HaMikdash there were certain windows that people used to come to when attending the temple, and out of these windows it would be sprinkled upon, en masse. Lots of people walk by, sprinkle on them just in case they're impure, and then they could walk into the temple premises. So the Rambam says, if somebody sprinkles Parah Adumah water from the window that's typically used to sprinkle on the public, and a guy walks in, he sees the sprinkling being done, walks by, gets sprinkled upon, goes into the temple under the impression that he's now pure. Then it turns out the water was disqualified. He's exempt. You don't have to bring a carbon for going into the temple in an impure state. The water used for public sprinkling, you can presume it's kosher. So the person who went by is like in a circumstance beyond his control. But if he goes to a private Parah Adumah provider, and he has some water sprinkled on him, he goes into the temple. Turns out the water was disqualified. He has to bring a sacrifice. The one that's required to bring when you inadvertently enter the temple in an impure state. Because he first should have checked the water, see if it's kosher, and then go into the temple. It's a private person. You must check. You must do due diligence. It says that Rambam, when it comes to the public windows, however, they were so sure. There was so much water dripping down from this public window. People used to purposely, play games, slip there and slide there. They would step on them and go into the temple, no problem, without even worrying that they are disqualified. Because again, it comes from a public window, no reason to be afraid. Let's say somebody sprinkles with a hyssop branch that turns out became impure on the Parah Adumah standard. In other words, one of those stringencies in chapter 13, 14 that becomes impure only for chatas level, and you use this hyssop in sprinkling. In yesh bei kibetza, if it has a volume of an egg, hamayim psulin v'azayasei psula, the water is disqualified. Disqualified, it's not impure, but you cannot use it. And the sprinkling is disqualified. Ein bei kibetza doesn't have a volume of an egg, so it never really fully became impure. Hamayim kshedim v'azayasei psula, so the water remains kosher, but the sprinkling that you did is disqualified, you got to redo it. But because we're dealing with chatas level, this hyssop, if it touches another one, will make it impure, and that will make the next one impure, even if it's 100. Because we don't count. When it comes to chatas, there's no limit to how far the chain can go. Today, when you put a new keli in the mikveh, when it comes out, there's always some water left inside. So if you have a utensil that became impure from a corpse, you sprinkled some Parah Adumah water on it, there's always going to be some water remaining on it. You pick up the utensil, and the amount of water that's in the utensil is enough to itself provide sprinkling material for other utensils. Tahar. The person is pure. Because at this point, the water that you're touching was already used for a mitzvah. Because the water which is used for a mitzvah already doesn't transmit impurity, as we explained, and therefore you're pure. Blessed is Hashem for helping us. Mazel tov for concluding the laws of Parah Adumah.